Good evening, everyone. I'm Lynn Mooney, co-owner of Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. And I'm here this evening with Katie Kitamura, who's going to be talking about her new book, Intimacies, and Dana Spiotta, who's going to be talking about her new book, Wayward. Thank you all for coming out this evening. We start all of our virtual events the same way we started our in-person events back in the day, with a land acknowledgement. I just want to acknowledge that the bookstore that I'm speaking from this evening is on the unceded territory of the Peoria and Potawatomi people. We encourage everyone this evening to learn more about the land and land acknowledgements generally, but also the land where you are this evening and who the rightful owners of that are. Also, I want to mention, if for those viewers who are in Chicago, the store is mostly reopened. We're mostly back to our normal hours. And please come visit us. If you're not in Chicago, we do ordering. Go to our website, womenandchildrenfirst.com. Enjoy your visit there. We ship, so if you're interested in ordering, please do. I want to mention to everyone that the chat is there to be enjoyed. If you have a question for either of the authors tonight, if you would please put it in the Ask a Question field, and they'll be looking at that throughout the evening. Also, if you haven't already purchased the two books, we'd love for you to buy them from us, and the handy Buy the Books tab will walk you through that process. So that's the general housekeeping. I just want to briefly introduce our two authors, not that I think they really need to be introduced. Katie Kitamura is the author of 4 books, including the 2017 novel A Separation, which was a New York Times notable book. Kitamura has written for varied publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Granta. She teaches in the creative writing program at New York University. And she's here this evening to discuss her latest book, Intimacies. Intimacies is a nuanced and controlled psychological novel focusing on a woman who has moved from New York to The Hague, where she works as a translator in a court where cases of genocide are tried. It's a fabulous book. I hope many of you have already read it, and if you haven't, please do so soon. Dana Spiotta is the author of 5 books, including Stone Arabia, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, and Eat the Document, which was a National Book Award finalist. Spiada was a Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2017, the American Academy of Arts and Letters awarded her the John Updike Prize in Literature. She lives in Syracuse and teaches in the Syracuse University MFA program. Her latest novel, Wayward, is about a perimenopausal woman who buys a rundown house and leaves her husband, yes, in that order, not after the inauguration of Donald Trump. Well, I think it's counterintuitive. He points out you would expect to leave the husband and then think about shelter, but well, it's all about the house. Her 17-year-old daughter, Allie, is also a really interesting and important character. So a wealth of wonderful women characters of various ages in these 2 books. And on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Katie now.
Lynn, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you for those beautiful introductions, and thank you so much for sharing your virtual bookshop space with us. I'm so incredibly honored to be here with Dana, who's a writer whose work has meant so much to me. And it's kind of wild to me that I can call her Dana, and to be here with her talking about our books. I'm going to read a very short section from near the start of my book, Intimacies. The novel is about an interpreter who moves to The Hague to take a job working at a war crimes tribunal. And this section is about interpretation and some of the kind of moral quandaries that open up around the act of interpretation, but it's primarily an anecdote that's being told to her by a colleague called Amina. And as they say, I think that is all you need to know. It should just be a few minutes. As I sat down at my desk, I recalled an anecdote that Amina had told me not long after I arrived at the court. It was a story I thought of often. She had been tasked with interpreting for the accused, working in Swahili, and was briefly the only interpreter on the team with adequate fluency to perform the task. Her booth partner did not have a strong grasp on the language and said in private that her mind had drifted during the lengthy sessions. She listened to the originating English and French, but less closely to Amina's interpretation. But Amina herself was under considerable pressure. She was negotiating marathon sessions that were far longer than standard. She sat in the mezzanine level booth, the accused positioned directly below her in the courtroom. He was still a young man, a former militia leader, wearing an expensive suit and slouched in an ergonomically designed office chair. He was on trial for hideous crimes, and yet he simply looked, as he sat, sullen and perhaps a little bored. Of course, the accused are often in suits and in office chairs, but the difference lay in the fact that at the court, the accused had not merely been dressed up for the occasion, but were men who had long worn the mantle of authority conveyed by a suit or uniform, men who were accustomed to its power. And they had a kind of magnetism, in part innate and in part heightened by the circumstances. The accused had an aura when they were brought to the Hague. We had heard a great deal about these men, and they were almost always men. We had seen photographs and video footage, and when they finally appeared in the court, they were the stars of the show. There is no other way of putting it. The situation staged their charisma. In the case of this particular man, he was not only young and undeniably handsome, but he had a dazzling air of command. Even without the aid of the courtroom, it was easy to see why and how so many people had obeyed his orders. But it was not even this, Amina explained. It was the intimacy of the interpretation. She was interpreting for one man, and one man alone, and when she spoke into the microphone, she was speaking to him. Of course, she had known when she had accepted the post in The Hague that the substance of the court would be darker than the United Nations, where she had previously been working. After all, the court concerned itself exclusively with genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. But she had not expected this kind of proximity, although she was never face to face with the accused and was always safely ensconced behind the glass-fronted interpreter's booth. She was constantly aware that she and the accused were the only two people in the courtroom who understood the language she was speaking. Over the course of these first sessions, Amina grew increasingly uneasy. The case involved a great deal of testimony regarding terrible atrocity, and hour by hour, she carried this testimony from one language into another. She found herself on occasion struggling to control the tremor in her voice. She felt herself becoming entirely too emotional. But then, as quickly as the second day, and for reasons she did not fully understand, a certain hardness overtook her. She discovered a new and acerbic tone, not exactly neutral, perhaps even reproachful. At one point, as she relayed the details of an embezzlement scheme, something that was morally questionable, but a trifle compared to the other charges against the man, she found herself using a voice of cold disapproval, as if she were a wife scolding a husband for some small domestic failing, neglecting to do the dishes, for example, rather than addressing his rampant infidelity, or the fact that he had gambled away their life savings. At that moment, to her surprise, she saw the accused turn his head and look up in the direction of the interpreters. Until this point, he had sat almost entirely still, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him, as if the entire matter was beneath him, although the result, Amina thought, was not the appearance of dignity. Rather, he looked like a sulky teenager being reprimanded for some infraction for which he refused to repent. There were perhaps half a dozen interpreters seated in the mezzanine-level booths. It was unlikely that he would know which one of them was his. She had never before noted him observing them. She forced herself to keep her voice steady and focus on the job at hand. The last thing she wanted to do was get distracted. Nonetheless, she was unable to keep from surreptitiously watching the accused as his gaze swept the glass-fronted booths. Perhaps feeling her eyes upon him, he suddenly stopped and looked directly at her, turning in his chair in order to do so. Amina couldn't help it. She stumbled over her words, apologized, nearly lost the thread of what was being said. He continued to stare at her, a grim expression of satisfaction settling into his handsome face, perhaps because he had succeeded in intimidating her, in causing her to falter. She felt at once, even through the glass wall dividing them, the totality of the man's will. Now it's over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Katie. We're going to both read and then talk, but I just have to say the precision of that section and throughout the whole book of those levels of interpretation that she's doing, not just of the language, but of what he's doing with his body and her is so incredible and so unsettling. And then the layer of this is actually Amina telling it to the narrator, and the narrator is reporting it after it's been told. So it's so complex and powerful. And I have questions. I just had to comment. It's my great honor to be here with you. And this amazing book, which I've read twice now, is just, it's incredible. I'm going to read something much lighter.
I refused to read after Dana. I should say for the group, I insisted. I said, I'm not going to follow Dana Spiotta. It's just, that's not something that's not going to happen to me.
I tried to insist as well, but I was overruled. No. So I'm going to read this section from Allie, who is the daughter, who's almost 17. And I guess what you need to know about this is she's trying to write her college essay, and she has a secret relationship with this developer who's also a libertarian, and she's becoming disillusioned with him. And she's very interested in language as well. Why I'm Not a Libertarian by Ali Raymond. At first, some of it made sense, but not totally. The way some people look pretty if you kind of squint at them. But then you really look and not so much. Let's start with that word, libertarian. From the root liberty, which ultimately leads to liber and libertas, free, unrestricted, absent of restraint. Who doesn't want to be free? So does a libertarian identify with this need to be free, like a vegetarian identifies with this need to not eat animals? One is not a person who values freedom among other ideals. One is a person who puts his freedom above all other concerns. Further definitions of liber: unbridled, unchecked, licentious. So libertarians, they describe themselves as believing in ultimate equality without condescending nanny state interference. They extol an unfettered marketplace where all can compete fairly. And by fair, they draw a careful distinction. Equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. But let's look at how that plays out in the real world. A libertarian might see a homeless person with a sign asking for money and say something like, "Don't give him money, he'll just spend it on beer." And you might be thinking, so what? Wouldn't you want a beer if you had to sleep under a fucking highway overpass? Maybe you don't want to say all of that. If you press the libertarian to elaborate further, he will tell you that he believes the person is homeless because he made poor choices. We shouldn't be responsible for the consequences of other people's poor choices. So my question is, how much are our choices shaped by things we didn't choose? But I didn't say that. A libertarian might also take federal, state, and county tax breaks in shitty, desperate cities that will do anything for development. But how is that the unfettered marketplace? Isn't that the same as taking government handouts, just handouts for already rich developers? I never said this either. And what about all the things people need to do collectively, like fire departments and utilities and the post office and schools? What about the rapidly unfolding climate cataclysm? Maybe the market has a role, but what if people's interests are at odds with profits? How can that be resolved except through collective values and, well, constraints? Even if you think the market can solve climate change with private entrepreneurship via semi-publicly funded, privately owned 5G, the fourth industrial revolution, AI, nanotech, data hubs, additive manufacturing, and edge computing, etc., then why isn't it happening yet? I didn't ask this question, but I thought of versions of it many times. Also, protection of private property requires police and prisons and copyrights. So libertarians like rules in some cases. Maybe they are not for total liberty, but for protecting their own liberty at the expense of others. Nope, didn't even suggest this idea. Finally, is it really a net good to take beautiful old buildings, old schools, libraries, religious buildings, and by dint of, I don't know, say $4.6 million in tax breaks, turn them into tacky condos and co-work spaces for tech bros? Shouldn't we all have access to these buildings, even if we don't have the public will to build like that anymore, or especially maybe? Isn't it a little problematic to turn spaces dedicated to people like St. Marianne Cope into private spaces? And furthermore, what about mixing in design cliches like barn doors on buildings designed for elegant respite, not gaming chairs and Tabata gym sessions? Okay, now I'm scaring myself because I sound like my mom, LOL. Still, one can see that the publicly funded rehab of beautiful old buildings for private profit is an interesting way to regard Joe and his philosophy. There's something fake in the apartments and how they are not really well made. The key is to appear well made. Is it a prosthesis for actually making something beautiful? Pro means add or in, and thesis is from typhenai, meaning put down, place in place of something missing. So he uses high-key, cliche touches to signal something classy, like subway tile and granite slabs and reclaimed gray-tinted hardwood in place of actual historically relevant and thoughtful renovation. But my point is that could be a metaphor for a lot of what Joe does in his life. Allie stopped writing and stared at her laptop. She realized that this was not really a college essay, or what had begun as her college essay had morphed into a harsh breakup letter to Joe. Yet when she thought of him, his body with his soapy smell, and the way he kissed her neck and ears, she shook off the thought, buried it. Thus she discovered, and could not undiscovered, that you could want someone, really want them, even though you no longer liked or respected them.
Thank you, Dana. That was stunning. And so funny. I was thinking, you know, your novel is so funny and so harrowing in different ways and at different points. But the parts that I really was kind of reading between my fingers were Allie's sections, which were incredibly kind of painful and enticing and smart and funny, but painful to read. And I realized that there's a kind of structure in the book where bit by bit you reveal the generations of women within this family. And it's very much a novel that is, I would say men have a very light footprint in this book overall. It's really about mothers and daughters, and then eventually about grandmothers, and then all the way back to this figure of Clara Loomis, who I hope we'll discuss. But I guess I just wanted to ask you, in that construction of these intergenerational relationships, you know, how were you using that to think about how, I guess, both ideology and idealism have kind of changed and transmit through the generations? Because there's this kind of generational gap between the ideals of these two characters.
Yeah, that's true. I think one thing I was thinking about is to be 17 is to be really smart, but also completely inexperienced, and to not really know what you don't know. And so it's kind of a dangerous time, I think, and maybe particularly for women. And I remember that so well. And I think what's interesting in a mother and daughter situation is this generational gap is that you can't tell the 17-year-old you don't know.
Yeah.
Because that's not really, they don't want to listen to that. So I think that what I discovered in the book is that Allie does kind of end up close to her mother in terms of values,
yes,
and in terms of idealism, but she has to go through this dangerous thing on her own, and she can't be told. She has to find out. So there's a lot of about it that I think being patient, that at different times in your life you learn things in different ways, and you can't kind of bear down too hard. And I think for Sam, the mother, she feels pretty shocked that she has that the world is still so difficult for women, and and that she feels very, and we'll get into this complacency. She feels complicit in this fact. Like she's been in the world for 53 years, and she hasn't fixed it. So when her daughter has contempt for her, she kind of thinks her daughter's right. Like, her generation is right. Like, why didn't I fix this? This is terrible. You know.
But at the same time, she knows that libertarianism is not the solution.
Yes. So it's like, it's very complicated, right? Yeah. So I think this is a kind of interesting thing about your book. Is the sense of, your narrator is so smart and she's such a great observer, but even she has so much difficulty with clarity, seeing herself clearly and seeing other people clearly. I mean, she gets Keys wrong in multiple times. She gets Adriaan wrong. Not wrong, but she sees that in a different context, she might have a totally different take on this person. So even her very perceptive observations do not give her any security that she's reading the world accurately. So I love that she is so that she's can't interpret the world a lot accurately. There's not enough there for her to really know where she stands. And it gives you this incredible sense of insecurity and fear as she's going through her life.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we actually before the official program started, or whatever you would call it, about how I think both our novels are, and certainly were, written during this kind of period of the Trump administration and the kind of upheaval of the last 4 or 5 years. And certainly one thing that I was thinking about is how difficult it is for people to reconcile the gap between their personal experience and their personal everyday concerns, and then these much larger narratives that are taking place around them. And I put my central character in a setting where, you know, history-making events are literally part of her workplace environment, and they're taking place all around her. But at the same time, she kind of knows enough to know that the single narrative is not all that is happening. And she only really has access to certain fragments of the story. And that happens again and again, certainly in her workplace. You know, she's interpreting little slivers of the evidence. Sometimes a very active interpretation leads to a kind of separation and alienation from the meaning of the words themselves. She becomes almost just like a kind of mechanical cog in the machine. And then again, in her personal life, she also only has little pieces of the story. So she's constantly struggling to create an overarching narrative. But I also think she knows that a single overarching narrative is just a fantasy. Like, she knows enough to know that that doesn't hold water. That's not actually how things stand, that everything is much more complicated. She looks at people and she understands that her reading of them is dependent on context and the way other people behave. And there isn't like a kind of essential self that you can apprehend once and be done. That kind of self is constantly shifting. And so that's a kind of, I guess, existential state of the narrator. And I think one of the movements that she makes in the novel is she moves towards a place of, I almost want to call it compromise, but she's trying to find a way to actually exist in the world. And part of existing in the world is saying, I know, but I'm going to pretend I don't know. And I'm going to be marked by my existence and compromised by my existence in the way that feels necessary in order to survive, I think.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I feel like with Sam, she kind of opens up in a very similar place. All the narratives that have contained her life are suddenly insufficient. They just are unbearable to her. And she has to leave. There's no question. I mean, as a reader, you know, I felt like you designed it so that it seemed, you know, in some ways absurd that she'd be leaving her wonderful husband and wonderful daughter to go to a house, but it completely plausible. I just felt that thing, like when the scales fall, it's really done. And I felt that a lot of the novel was her almost sifting through these shards of plausible explanations for what was happening in the world. But I guess I'll ask you about that aspect of your book.
Well, I think what's interesting is that, you know, this idea that there is not going to be this big narrative that makes everything make sense, and yet you still have to go on. And we are kind of these narrative making creatures, yes. Right? It's sort of, yes. We have to have, the world has to be legible in some way. So yes. We're kind of trying to piece it together. So, and interpret the world. But and I also think it's very poignant that, both of these women have this kind of clarity about how slippery that is, but they are still trying to do yes. it. Like, they haven't said, okay, I'm just going to buy into the narrative. Like the charismatic lead, you know, guys that are before the Hague, they have clarity about the narrative they're presenting, even if they kind of if you can see sort of the rough edges in it or the falsity in it. And I think when someone like the people in the world who double down on narratives that they know are false are very different from these characters who are trying to at least have some clarity that's authentic, even though that's impossible. It's almost like yes. the gesture matters.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, and I think it kind of results in a series of actions that feel incomprehensible to the world at large.
Yeah. Like why does your character she's staying in this apartment and she's trying to read the signs. Like, what does it mean that he's not here and he's not returning? And I think it's funny that both of our characters have this like very stressful relationship to texting, you know. I know, not returned.
I know it's true. They have a very stressful relationship to texting and also to, I would say, semi-temporary accommodation. They're both kind of in these precarious places where they're not really at home, but they're where they think could potentially be a home, maybe. I mean, the other thing that I was really struck by and which I felt gave such beautiful shape and movement to your novel was this question of place and the setting in Syracuse. And I was really thinking about, you know, about the notion that places are, you know, they carry the history of what's come before. They're kind of haunted in that way. And I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you used Syracuse as a location. And it felt like, you know, it's very tightly focused. The novel in the beginning is very much like Sam, and there's a handful of locations, and you're very much with her and her nuclear family. And then it just kind of, it's almost like the bottom drops out and it goes deeper and deeper. And I really felt that a lot of that had to do with Syracuse as a place and how you kind of mine it for the kind of texture of history, which sits alongside the very beautifully rendered, disembodied contemporary online life. Against all of that, there's actually the reality of place, which I think is inescapable in some ways for the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wanted it to have this constraint of 2017. So there's this time and also this place, Syracuse, and these very specific local concerns that I hope will reflect something bigger, but really kind of getting it down to her body and her menopausal symptoms and her insomnia, and in this house that's in this city. But, you know, so it's constrained by the city, but within the city, time does kind of go in all directions, right? And so you have this fluidity within this constraint. And I think Syracuse is an interesting place because, like many of these kind of Rust Belt type cities, it has an interesting history. And Syracuse has this 19th century history of all these interesting movements because of the Erie Canal. So the women's movement and abolition and all these interesting religious cults and temperance and vegetarianism. And it has this kind of American kind of secret history to it everywhere. Yes. And you see, and it's still pieces of it are everywhere. Once you start looking, you can't stop seeing it. And so then the city itself becomes a character that you can read. And then that sort of actually happens sort of later in the book. And that it's felt like a very interesting to take something that you know really well. She's lived there for a really long time and she suddenly sees it with new eyes. Yes. And then your book, and I wanted to ask you about this, but hey, it's sort of like, it's the same constraint of place, but it's the opposite. She's dropped down into this new place she thinks it's a new place. Yes. Spoiler, but so it has this uncanny feeling for her. And the place itself is very slippery. Like the more she gets to know it, the more she feels. There's that great, scene in the beginning when she first sees the cigarette butts being picked up in the cobblestones, and she realizes there's an artifice to this place. Yes, like there's something here that I'm not reading right yet. So she has to interpret the city itself. Can you talk about how you wrote about The Hague and what research you did? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, The Hague is a kind of funny place. It's very much dominated by these international institutions. It's a very kind of perfectly manicured place, and it's small. It's very, very small. But when you're there, you do realize that it is a place with lived hierarchies, and that there is labor that is keeping this kind of old world historical aesthetic. I mean, that's something else I want to ask you about, which is aesthetics, because that is so much part of what both Sam and Ali are actually reacting to. Like Ali, that her rejection of Dan is almost aesthetic, right? Like she hates the gross things he's putting in the condos. But there's a kind of cost to creating that and manicuring that heritage aesthetic. I mean, I was interested in thinking about, in the novel, there's a kind of divide between the people who are passing through the city and the people who are who are actually of the city in some way. And I would say about half the characters are really new to the city, and it's unknown how long they'll be there. They themselves don't know. They could be out in 6 months. They could decide to settle down there. And then there are people, in particular, a kind of set of 3 characters who are very much from the place and who are Dutch. And I guess I was really interested in thinking about how differently the city looks when you're visiting or when you are uncertain as to whether or not you'll stay, and there's a kind of haziness to it, versus when you're really ingrained in the hierarchy of a city. I mean, I went to The Hague. I mean, I had this funny experience because I did my research as novelists do. And I went to The Hague for about 2 weeks, and I sat in on a trial at the ICC, which is a kind of model for the court that appears in the book. And I interviewed interpreters, and I walked around the streets, and I chose the neighborhoods where my characters would live, and I took photos, all of that stuff. And the entire time I had this kind of feeling of uncanny familiarity. I felt like I knew this place, but I couldn't see how that could be. I'd spent time in Rotterdam and Amsterdam, but to my knowledge, not The Hague. And then when I finished writing the first draft of it, I suddenly realized that I had spent a lot of time there as a child because my father had taken his sabbatical in The Hague at one of the universities there. And so, but in my family, I mean, this is embarrassing. It's so silly, but in my family, they would always call it Den Haag. And I somehow just not had put the 2 names together, and the fact that the place I was writing about was a place that I had spent time. So that was an experience that was really kind of startling, where I saw my memories kind of fall into place, and I understood that all these slightly free-floating memories from my childhood actually had taken place in this city. And so I gave that experience to my central character, and that becomes kind of one of the emotional anchors of the novel.
So you took the draft and you added that in.
Yes.
And did that change the whole
Yes,
book?
completely. I think all of this kind of opening architecture of, am I going to stay? Am I not going to stay? The sense of looking for a place to belong, all of that was artificially bolted on in the second draft. But I think there was some kind of, and now I'm really just talking very openly kind of craft terms, but there was something that was missing, that was a kind of emotional through line for the novel, for sure. And that, I think, became the through line that I felt most comfortable with.
I want to talk about the emotions, because I think the intimacy of the title, and this character who is, she often reports things indirectly, right?
Yes.
And she does feel removed sometimes in her tone, and yet there is such emotional tension that you get in the book. And I was thinking, talk to me a little bit about the title. And I was thinking specifically when she's doing that interpreting, she's physically so close to the person. She's whispering in their ear, these perpetrators, and she can smell their cologne and their breath. Yeah. So the title is so evocative in the sense of like how you do. I mean, just the physicality makes you feel like you're colluding with the perpetrator, right? In some way, or they're contaminating you in a weird way.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I guess there are 2 things that I guess I could say about that. The first is that it was, again, I mean, I don't know how you write, but I feel like I write a relatively messy first draft, and then I look at it and I kind of figure out what the book is actually about. And when I finished writing the first draft of this book, I realized that there's a lot of sexual harassment and sexual intimidation in the book, and there's a lot of kind of physical infractions that take place in the book. And so there's this idea, we think of intimacy as something that is desirable and something that we want in our relationships with other people, but actually a lot of the book, even the majority of the book, is about intimacies that are being forced upon her that she actually doesn't want. So that sense of that, I think it's a physical proximity that makes her very, very uneasy. But it's also, I think, this excess of empathy that troubles her. And it is that connection, that sense of being, by speaking the words of another person or speaking the words for another person, you are somehow something is put into play, and you are in their shoes. And that, again, empathy is something that we're taught to to hone and to want. You know, I have kids, this kind of language of you want empathetic.
Especially as women, we're taught that.
Yes, and especially as women. And this whole language of kind of like, you know, be empathetic. But actually, I think there's certain dangers to empathy. And that was something that the character certainly experiences through that proximity. Is, as you say, it's almost like a kind of contamination. She finds that her subjective position is much less secure than she thought it was. She's actually very permeable to stepping into the point of view or the shoes of another person more than she would like to be, maybe.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about aesthetics and architecture, actually, because that is such a tool that you use in this novel. Both I think as a kind of there's an outrage that both, you know, I mean, when Sam leaves her home, she's like, I cannot be in this modernist or this clean house anymore. I need to be. And part of that, I wondered, is it because she actually can't stand the kind of erasure of history that is represented by this old house, or by the house she used to live in? Or what is the kind of, how are you using aesthetics in that sense?
It's I mean, you know, it's specific to this woman in this place in her life, but I think there's some houses are sort of designed for different kinds of living, right? Like they're machines for living.
Yes.
And so I think when she bought the house in the suburbs with her husband, that open plan, horizontal lines, lots of glass, lots of light, that felt right.
Yes.
But now she wants to sit by a tile fireplace and by herself, and this more cozy sort of old house that existed before she existed and will outlive her. Mm-hmm. Like that it kind of puts her in this humble position, you know, to be in this thing that is going to, you know, outlive her in some way. And so the flimsiness of the door, the hollow door in her suburban house really offends her because it won't outlive her.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's my guess. I think it's just this emotional reaction to space, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. But also the way that space, as you say, represents culture and history, or denies culture and history, which is something as well that obviously Ali is grappling with in the passage that you read. Is that like even something that seems as neutral as a doorknob is actually saying a great deal about how different institutional, you know, structures are working and operating.
And how things get overwritten, and kind of cheapened and commodified, in a way that you know, and the arts and crafts movement in particular, you know, is an interesting thing because it starts out very idealistically, this kind of, you know, this idea as a counter to the Industrial Revolution, going back to sort of a and then it just becomes a, you know, like lawyers want Tudor houses thing, you know?
Yes.
And so so aesthetics are complicated because they can be co-opted, as we know.
And their meaning changes, obviously.
And their meaning changes in the context, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, can I ask you about Clara Loomis? Because I'm scared we're going to run out of time.
I know.
And it's such a kind of she's such a kind of brilliant invention. And I guess I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about how she operates within the novel. And then also, did you always know, sorry, I know it's boring when people say the kind of, did you always know, but did you always know that she would be given this section towards the end of the book where she would speak? You know, a lot is said about Clara Loomis over the course of the novel. Her story is told by many people. Her story is judged by many people. And then in the next to final section, she's kind of given, it's really like a visitation. It felt to me like it made me really feel like, just in some ways, this was a novel about being haunted, not in a kind of crude way, but just a sense that, you know, that history was going to kind of come up to the surface. But yeah, could you share a little bit about this character?
Yeah, I would say I read an interview with you where you said, if you know you can write it, it's not worth writing, which I love. And I felt that way about this. Like I just thought, you know, it occurred to me as I was writing, I was like, you know what, she should speak for herself at some point. And I was like, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. It's not possible. But then as I was writing, go ahead.
When you say you don't know how to do that, in what sense? I mean, to me, that's inconceivable because I'm like, Dana Spiotta can do anything. And also when I read them, I was like, she can really do anything. So when you say you can't do that, what aspect of it?
Well, I'd never written a historical
novel
figure, you know, in 19th century. I didn't know, the language, everything. So, so I had this thought that I should, and I thought I can't.
Yeah.
So I just, I went and stayed in Oneida, and I read, I did all these things, and I thought, maybe I'm not going to do it because I just don't know how to fucking do it. And then it kind of came, the moment came where I was like, okay, she's going to be Allie's age. Like she's just when she's idealistic, we're talking about the generational idealism, you know, before she became this compromised figure, and she's just trying to escape dying in childbirth, you know? And the horrible idea of what it means to be a Victorian, woman in Victorian society. And there's a place that it offers something else, this radical place. And then it came, right. And then I thought, say what you said in that same interview, which is like, take this risk, because there's nothing more boring than a writer not taking a risk, the writing what they already know. You can feel the energy if somebody's taking a risk.
Yes.
And you can always throw it away if it doesn't work out. You know? Like, oh yeah, no, that's not going to be fun, right?
But Dana, when I read that section, I literally thought, I Googled to check if Clara Loomis was a real person, because I thought you had taken her letters and just put them into the novel, because it felt so persuasive to me.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I was really like, oh, she's doing something where she's taking archival materials and presenting them within the novel, but that's all made up. All made up.
John Humphrey Noyes is real. He's a real figure.
Yes.
And I have to, spoiler alert, he does have sex with her in this. It's very kind of biblically described, but so that, I'm sure that offended historians, when you take a historical figure and you mix them with an imaginary figure, but we novelists just do shit like that.
Just like, what can you do? What can you do? I have another question, which is about, you are so incredibly, no, can I just have to ask this one quick question, because I think which is about subcultures and how you pop them open in your research, I guess, to create them and invoke them. And one thing I feel like I've been reading a lot of novels that are kind of are about the internet, as they say. Yeah. But one of the things I really loved in Wayward is the way the inventiveness and the strangeness of language on the internet is put on the page, and it has this kind of incredible energy. And I almost felt like it was one of the most effective books I've read about the internet in a way. And I think it's because of the way you mine the language of the internet. And I just wondered, I found when I was researching Intimacies that it was really useful to go to The Hague and to do all this, to kind of be there physically. But the most useful thing was actually the transcripts from the trials, which are available online. It was actually through the language that I felt like I accessed something really fundamental about the headspace and the atmosphere of the place. And I just wondered if, when you're researching, whether it's a historical period or the internet or whatever it is language the way in for you, or is it, I don't know, character and point of view in a particular subjective experience?
It's 100% what you say. It's writing down all the language that you notice, and kind of making that your own, and then combining that with the character so you can feel them speaking in that language. Yeah. And I think noticing the particular, sort of a jargon of any particular subgroup is really funny. And then you kind of dislocate it a little bit or look at it with those strange eyes. And I think that the key is that slight estrangement that you get when you're putting it in a novel. So you take something that's really, from Facebook, and you put it in a novel, and we all sort of see it in a different way. And you can kind of see it clearly instead of just sort of, it's not so familiar. And I think that, and my research is the same as what you described. I have a cousin who's really active on Facebook, and I knew that the algorithm would work appropriately for her because I'm not. So I stayed at her house for like 4 days, and she let me just watch her go on Facebook. And
so when you say that,
and she sent me screenshots for months. She sent me screenshots of things that she noticed that she knew I would like. Of conversation.
And those groups and all the names of those groups. That's from
Yeah,
Oh
so
my
that got
gosh.
inspired by that. But I have a notebook, and I'm sure you do this too, where where it's like you're just kind of like taking down a lot more than you're going to use.
Yes.
And it's partially just to get the feel of it in your mouth and your brain of what it feels like to use that language, so it can come out in dialogue in a comfortable way.
Yeah. And then I feel like you kind of pour a lot onto the page, and then you take away what feels like. I mean, I don't know. I can feel like when I'm showing my research, just to make sure everybody knows I did my research, versus when it's actually there, right? So it's just a kind of classic thing of like remembering to take down the scaffolding.
Exactly. Oh, and I think we should go to our
we're supposed to go to our questions. Yeah. So questions are in Ask a Question.
Okay.
From
conception to I'll ask this one to you. From conception to publication, how long did it take for you to write your book?
This is for me. Okay. Oh, now sorry, I'm going to close the window again. From conception to conception is a long time ago. My first inkling of the book was in 2009. So that would make my total thing like it happened when I heard Charles Taylor, who's a former president of Liberia, and he spoke in his own defense at his trial in The Hague, and it was like an incredibly troubling moment for me to find myself kind of both horrified but also fascinated by him as a figure. And so the very seed of the book was then. But I started writing in 2016. I can remember very precisely. Hari and I were, my husband, and who's also a novelist, and I were in Berlin, and Hari was writing his Trump era novel, which is called Red Pill, which has some similarities, Dana, with Wayward. And I feel
he could be in this conversation.
He could, and you and Hari have also written about radical. Like there are definitely parallels. So I suppose, and then I finished writing it in 20. I mean, that sounds so long. I had a baby as well. I want to add in the middle of it to explain why that timeline is so long. But yeah, I guess about 4 years, and then there's another year and a half, with editing and publication and all of that. But
you don't get this kind of compression quickly. You know what I mean? Like this, it does take labor that you have. It's a taut book. It's a very intense book. You can't put it down. You're reading it and you just feel on the edge until you finish it,
Thank you.
And that takes time, I think.
I wrote long sections that ended up getting tossed.
Yeah.
Okay. For Dana, how Ali wrote parts of her essay sounded like a list in a way. She contemplates specifically on ideas and interpretations of the word libertarian. My question is, did you start with a list before you wrote the college essay, then riff on the ideas of libertarian?
That's a good question. I think Ali is a very methodical character. And so I think she's just she's in this thing called Young American Disruptors. It's kind of like modeled loosely on Model UN, where she marshals her, don't tell my daughter, and she's marshaling her evidence. She's making her argument. So she's kind of like, boom. So I think that's her style. Yeah. Okay. So we have one more. Let me go down here. Okay. Come on, ask more questions. All right. Connected to the idea of space you were just discussing, Katie, aside from the court and the city, houses, apartments play an important role. True, yes. The narrator's temporary place, Jana's new apartment, and Adriaan's empty house. Wonder if you can talk more about the idea of home in the novel. The narrator's asked a few times, where is home to? Great question.
Yeah. I mean, this relates a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier about The Hague, and this kind of realization that I had spent this time there, and that there was a sense in which I had some kind of pre-existing relationship to the place. And when I realized that, then this question of home became very central to the novel. But much in the way I think that, Dana, in your book, these houses have a kind of meaning beyond their systems, their machines. They dictate a certain way of living and a certain perspective. I wanted to kind of create these spaces that would kind of delineate the various positions of the characters in relationship to the city. So she lives in kind of the housing that you would, you would find online before you move to a city, the kind of temporary housing with kind of not so great furniture. Her friend Jana, who is kind of a creative class, but perhaps not especially wealthy, lives in a rapidly gentrifying area, and that has its own kind of complexities. And then Adriaan, her pseudo boyfriend, I guess is what you might call him, he lives in this kind of place where he's very much ensconced by his wealth, and it kind of, there's a long section where she talks about the security system in the house, and it was so long, and my editors were like, it really doesn't need to be this long, you can really pare it back, we get the point after a little bit. But I was really interested in this idea of kind of like how spaces are surveyed, how they're guarded, what does that mean in terms of how we live within the space, and then how we operate outside of the space as well.
And it also fits in with being complicit and being compromised, because even Jana, she's like, as soon as you own property, all of a sudden your relationship to the police changes, your relationship to security in the neighborhood, that she doesn't want to be a gentrifier, but she knows she kind of is.
Yes, exactly.
But then the narrator counters that by saying, yeah, but on the other hand, how secure can you really be? I mean, you're still trying to pay a mortgage, right? Like you're not really an owner of anything,
Yes. But I mean, I guess
I love the way you undercut these ideas. I love that.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of linked to, kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is the idea of complicity and implication, and kind of like constantly thinking about all the many, many ways that we are implicated in these systems because we're part of them, no matter how much. And that's a lot of what your characters are thinking about as well. But you can't really fully extract yourself from them. And I guess one of the things that the character, or my character, realizes is that it's like just by using the language, she's speaking the language of the court, that makes her part of the institution, whether she wants to think so or not. Whether she just thinks of herself as somebody that language passes through, it's still leaving a kind of sticky residue. And how can you possibly fully extract yourself? So I mean, one of the opening of the novel is really about this character going to her friend's apartment, and her friend is a gentrifier, and trying to figure out kind of what that means and how that has changed her relationship to the city and her relationship to ideas of security. Wait, I'm going to check the questions. Oh, what writers are you reading that take your breath away?
Well, I can't imagine anybody hasn't heard about this, but Anthony So's collection of stories, After Parties, is, if you haven't read it, you gotta read it. It's just brilliant and funny and original. And he was a student in our MFA program, and so it's very sad that he died. But the book is a beauty, and very funny, very funny. What about you, Katie? What have you read?
That book is very high on my list. The last thing that literally took my breath away was Adalbert Stifter's Rock Crystal. Have you read this?
No.
He's this 19th century Austrian writer and landscape painter, and he wrote these little series of novellas. And I think Rock Crystal is like a kind of classic in Austria and Germany, but it's really simple. It's two little children who are trying to make their way home on Christmas Day through a snowstorm. And it is, I don't know if you remember, like when I read Natalia Ginzburg, when I read The Dry Heart, and the scene where, I can't plot spoil her book. That's just too bad. But there's a scene where something terrible happens, and I remember when I read it, I had such a kind of physical reaction, and my heart was kind of, I felt this almost presence of something malevolent, and I had a very similar reaction when I was reading Rock Crystal. And the other thing,
is it dark in that way?
It's like it's 90 pages long, and you just can't put it down because you are so stressed out about what is going to happen to these.
I felt that way reading your book.
And then the other thing, which I can't recommend strongly enough, is the Copenhagen Trilogy. By Tove Ditlevsen, which is very similar. It's like once you pick it up, it's like Rock Crystal. You just have to stay inside the world of that novel until you're done. Or I don't know. Is it categorized as memoir rather than?
Yes,
it's memoir, isn't it? Yeah, you stay inside the world of that book until you come out. So
I wanted to ask you. I was thinking about when you were talking about charismatic the charisma of the perpetrators in the book. Have you seen that movie, The Act of Killing?
Yes.
What do you think about that movie? It feels like it seems like it speaks. Those characters in your book reminded me of those guys.
I love that film. I mean, I don't know. Is it? I don't know if it's controversial in some way.
It is still kind of controversial because he made them too charismatic. Like they spoke for themselves. These Indonesian, death squad guys. Yes.
And they did this kind of restaging of their
as like Bollywood or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think it.
It's a very unsettling film.
It's very, very unsettling. I mean, I think it has a lot. I mean, one thing that I'm always thinking about, certainly in this book and the book before that, is a question of performance and how performance functions. And the reason I was drawn to the court as a setting is because it's like an arena, it's like a stage, and it's a place that people go in and they necessarily create something artificial in order to uncover perhaps something that feels true. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the ideal of how a court might function. And then I'm always interested in like the parts that people play. In my last book, the starting premise for me was always the idea that a woman would be separated from her partner, but pretend that she was still with him when he is found dead. And so this idea of how you play a part, and then eventually the gap between the performance and the self is kind of reduced. So the act of killing is about performance, and it's about trauma as well, right? It's about it's exactly about creating a narrative in the face of that trauma, and it is centered on the experience of those particular men. I mean, I found it very, very troubling. I found it very shocking in a lot of ways.
It's one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen.
But it has really, I mean, I saw that when it came out, which was 5-6 years. It was quite a while ago, and it has really stayed with me. I mean, it's also really interesting because it makes you kind of question the kind of ethical role of beauty, because it's beautiful. It's a beautiful film, and these kind of fantasias that these men create are beautiful. And that's when I was trying to work out how to represent the kind of trial and the question of what this character was being accused of. I always knew it was very important to me that he was not the person to describe what he had done, but rather that would be told from the perspective of one of the witnesses and one of the victims, and that character would be allowed to tell her story rather than having him kind of narrate it and kind of be allowed the opportunity to kind of warp.
So you made that was an ethical choice on your part.
Yeah. I was very,
you didn't want to like make it, I hate that expression, like pornography of atrocity or whatever, but you didn't want it to be,
I mean, I knew it had to be present in some way to give a kind of the depth of what was being discussed. But I mean, my starting point and my kind of unease was always listening to Charles Taylor defend himself, and I knew that I just couldn't. It was never a possibility for me that the person who's the perpetrator, that the accused, would be given that kind of stage,
I love that.
Like I just thought that can't happen. So instead, he never speaks in the court. We never see him kind of explain what he's done. And instead it's this young woman who has witnessed these atrocities who speaks. And for that, I mean, I relied very heavily on transcripts, and I looked very precisely at how these witnesses would tell their story, how the story would be framed within the court, because it felt very important to me to have that as close as possible.
You don't want to get that wrong. No.
You don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to get it wrong, and you don't want to. I mean, you definitely don't want to get it wrong from lack of trying. If you see what I mean, from being like too lazy to kind of go through the transcripts and kind of see how it was constructed. So that was. Are there any other questions?
No, and it's 9 o'clock.
It's 9 o'clock, so we should say a huge thank you to Lynn, who I think isn't going to pop back on.
No. Oh my God, Lynn, thank you.
Oh, Dana, thank you. I'm gonna send you the post match text messages.
Yes, this was really fun. You were great. And then don't respond to me, and I'll be all
I know. It'll be metafictional.
Oh my God! Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much, Dana.
Bye.
This was such a treat. Thank you.
It was such a treat, Katie. Bye.